If you're a follower of my work, you'll know that I have been critical of church apps for many, many years. But it's 2023, and so that means it's time to reassess because technology changes fast, which means we need to reevaluate our positions frequently. What we believed last year or in years prior may not be the best position to hold today. And to that end, I think I'm finally ready to say it. I am just as opposed to church apps as I've ever been. In fact, I've been doing this for 10 years now, and my thesis is this. For 99% of churches, an app will be a net negative. Invest in your website instead. Let's talk about why. Let's first make sure that we're all on the same page with what we're talking about when we use the term church app. What we're not talking about are custom church apps developed from scratch for your church. Those will run you 5 to 6 figures in cost, plus ongoing support and maintenance. Think the church home app. That's a custom app for a church. If you are a church in a position to make that kind of investment, you might be an outlier. You might land in that 1% of churches where an app could be the right call. But we're not talking about that here. We're talking about church apps from platforms like Subsplash, Planning Center, Tithely, PushPay, and others. Apps that are commonly bundled with your giving or CHMS providers. Apps that are created from a commercialized template. Now, if you look back at the videos that I've made being critical of apps in the past, let's look at the years I made those videos, 2016, 2018, and 2019. So 3 videos in 4 years, and now it's 2023, and I have not published anything new on apps in close to 4 years. Why? Well, because a massive shift occurred in the church tech world, and apps went from semi-expensive line items in a church budget that would run you roughly $100 to $150 a month to instead throw-ins with other church software. Sign up for our giving platform, and we'll get you a free app. Church tech platforms merged, big ones bought smaller ones, and now the only major players in the church app world are companies that offer apps as just one of their products. Planning Center started as a services planning software. Now they have their Church Center app. Tithely and PushPay were giving platforms first. Now they have Church App by Tithely and My Church by PushPay, their app products. Subsplash, well, they were the original app provider for churches, but now they also offer giving, church management, websites, and more. So why have I not talked much about apps in 4 years? Well, because the landscape of church tech changed pretty dramatically, and maybe your church has an app now, not because you went out of your way necessarily to sign up for a church app platform, but because you needed giving or a website or church management, and the platform that you partnered with threw in a church app for your troubles. That's very common for many, many church apps today. And look, I'm about to be critical of church apps for 3 main reasons. What that doesn't mean is that I'm being critical of you or your church. And that's what I want to be crystal clear on. My hope is that we can evaluate the viability of church apps in a vacuum and that you don't feel like that has to reflect on you as a person or your church. And maybe your church has an app, maybe you don't. Should you though? Let's talk about it. Here are my 3 big reasons why in 2023 I would skip it and invest in your website instead. Reason number 1, app containers. The first thing you need to understand about church apps is that for most of us, our app will live in a container on the App Store. Tithely's app container is called Church App by Tithely. Planning Center's is called Church Center App. Subsplash's is called The Church App. PushPay's is called My Church by PushPay. And what this means is that if you get a church app, your app will not show up directly in the App Store. It will live in one of these containers. And a user will have to first download the container, then search for your church name alongside every other church in that app container's directory to then find and access your church app. Now, why is this? Well, in late 2017, Apple introduced Guideline 4.2.6, which said apps created using a, quote, commercialized template or app generation service, end quote, would be banned from the App Store. Now, not surprisingly, this generated a ton of backlash. Press releases were published, church app companies scrambled to find solutions, the forums went crazy, that's right, forums were a thing back then. People were freaking out, and rightfully so. And thankfully, Apple heard the cries of its users and amended the rule. Guideline 4.2.6 was updated to read, quote, apps created from a commercialized template or app generation service will be rejected unless they are submitted directly by the provider of the app's content, end quote. Still not great, but better. And the workaround looked like this. You as the church needed to create an Apple developer account yourself. You'd probably need to be on one of the higher cost plans from a church tech company because you need an actual rep to walk you through this sometimes complicated process. But you'd still get that same app template from their app generating service. The difference would be that this way would allow you to bypass Apple's rule and actually have your church's app in the App Store directly, not in the container app. With that being said, most churches still opted to be in the container app rather than jump through all of those hoops, let's say. Now, you might be wondering, how could Apple have the power to simply reject template-based apps? Simply put, their house, their rules. And this is one of the paramount weaknesses of church apps. You don't own the distribution. Apple does. You can't go somewhere else to get apps on iOS devices. You must go through Apple. So you're on rented space, and they can change the rules on a whim as they did and have. And this is also why I don't really care for the language that some church tech companies use when describing their apps. Tithely says, quote, "Your time is precious, so we build custom church apps that work," end quote. Subsplash says, quote, "Deepen discipleship with custom church apps." Planning Center and PushPay stop short of saying custom app and instead say things like custom branded or custom content. I find some of this language misleading because Apple themselves has disqualified these kinds of commercialized template or app generation services in many respects because they're deemed to not be custom. Now, how do the app companies feel about this new rule that Apple introduced several years ago? It's a bit tricky to parse sometimes. For example, Subsplash has a container app called the Church app, like we discussed, but they can also create standalone apps for your church so long as you first get your church an Apple developer account and go through that process. As for the difference in pricing, I'm not sure. None of it's public. You have to get on the phone with someone. What's curious about Subsplash is that their own web materials seem to be at odds with the fact that they offer a container app. For example, this is from an article on their site that criticizes certain church apps because they live in containers. Quote, "This is an unfamiliar process. It can take longer for your users to get familiar with a container app and fully adopt using them. Having your own custom branded app on the Google or Apple app stores provides a much better experience for your users. They can simply download and install your church's app for free directly from the app stores," end quote. So my sense is that Subsplash doesn't recommend using a container app, which I would agree with, but they have one. And I can't find any online materials from them that talk about reconciling those conflicting positions. And look, I'm confident they have their take on it. I wasn't able to track it down, but let's now talk about the second reason I think a church app is going to be a net negative for 99% of churches, and that is features. And let's start here with the list of features that Tithely promotes concerning their app. Prayer wall, sermons and podcast, giving, groups, sermon notes, calendar, personalized user profiles, social media integration, blog, photos and videos, interactive sermon notes, and push notifications. Now, every single one of those features, save for one, is available with a Nucleus website, for example. Nucleus is my church tech platform. We make a lot of things, including websites, but we don't make apps. And yes, I have a bias, and we'll get to that in a moment. The thing is, your church needs a website. You don't need an app. So what is it that an app is offering your church that your website cannot facilitate? Is it the novelty of having your church's name in the App Store? We already talked about that. Now it's probably in a container. No, the novel feature is push notifications, right? The final feature I mentioned on that list. So let's talk about it. And we'll get this out of the way first. Desktop notifications are now mainstream. Well, let's be honest, they still can't compete with mobile notifications, right? Because you don't carry around your desktop computer in your pocket. I'll gladly concede that. What I want to talk about, though, is how people feel about push notifications. Because if this is going to be the standout feature that apps can offer our churches that websites cannot, it's got to be moving the needle for us in big ways. But this is from the US Mobile App Report. It says, quote, 71% of millennials say they get annoyed when they get too many app notifications, and more than 50% of those older than 35 years old agree. In that same report, quote, less than 1 in 5 people say that they always agree to an app's request to allow push notifications. In the 35 plus age demo, this number drops all the way to 1 in 20 people. Now, will you see those same enrollment rates in push notifications at your church? That's impossible to predict, because what we also know is that push notification adoption rates vary greatly across app categories. For ride sharing and delivery apps, many of us have push notifications turned on because we need them. For social media apps, many of us have push notifications turned off because they're not urgent. And the reason I share data from that report is really just to frame how people feel about push notifications. And from young to old, most of us get annoyed by too many, and our default position is to not enable them, which is a massive blow to what should be the feature of your church's app that makes it distinct. I think now is also a good time to say this. I'm not here to say websites are 100% good and apps are 100% bad. My thesis is that for 99% of churches, apps will be a net negative. So in the aggregate, weighing all of the pros and cons, I'd recommend against them. But push notifications can be useful. They just tend to not be adopted at a high enough rate to make going all in with an app worth it, especially when there are alternative options like email notifications and text notifications. And for me, a single feature that an app has that a website doesn't is not enough to overcome the mountain of strikes against it, especially when we consider adoption rates of said feature. And if that's not enough, here's where things get really aggravating for me. Because I tested the Tithely Church app, I tested the PushPay Church app, I tested the Subsplash Church app, and I tested the Planning Center Church app. And guess what? When I would go to give, or when I would go to sign up for something happening at the church, I was taken to the church's website. So let's go through the order of operations here. I pay for a custom church app. It gets put into a container in the App Store. I promote it to my church. They search for the container app in the App Store. They download it to their mobile device. They search my church name in the container app. They find it. They go to give or sign up for an event, and they get directed to the church's website. Then you get a bill for that month for using the app. Why am I paying money for a redirection tool to my website that I can only use when I download it to my phone? Now, an app company might tell you that the reason that they take you to the website to give is because if you give in the app itself, Apple will take a big cut of that gift. This is ironic because these church app companies are also taking a cut of that gift, but we covered that in another video. But here, Apple again is rearing its head and reminding you that you do not own the app because you do not own the distribution. And if we need to send people to our website because we can't let them do something on the app, then is that not a reason to not have the app? And why then are we sending people to sign up for events on our website that are free events? Why not do that in the app? Let's imagine you're having a similar problem with your church's website, and for whatever reason, your web host has introduced new rules that are unfriendly to churches. All right, you move to another web host. There are literally thousands. So with your website, you own the distribution because you have the autonomy to choose your distribution partner. But the App Store is a monopoly, which means that we're all subject to Apple's decisions. There's nothing we can do. Now, to be fair, at this point, you might be saying, okay, Brady, I get your point. But what's the harm? We have the app. It's not costing us much. We might as well use it, right? What's the harm? And this gets me to my third criticism of church apps, and it's something I call promotion budget. It's the same idea as a money budget. You only have so much of the resource to spend. And in your church, you have to make a decision. Either your website or your app is going to be the center of your digital universe, the center of your next steps universe. Every promotion, every event, every ministry opportunity is going to come down to either your church app or your church website. At least it should. The paradox of choice would instruct us here. Fewer options equals more action. And for many churches, we still might offer offline options for next steps and online options. That makes sense, right? One's analog, let's say, one's digital. They're two different worlds. But what we don't need are two digital options that facilitate the same thing. Churches will say in their promos, sign up on our website or the church app. And then I go to the church app and it takes me to the website. And then what about you, the staff, maintaining and supporting multiple platforms that accomplish the same thing? We so frequently say in our churches, resources are scarce, time, money, creative energy. I have all these hats. Understood. Well, then let's not burden ourselves with twice the work by getting sucked into the allure of an app just so you now have to maintain two platforms that do the same thing. And now as you promote them, your website matters, but your app matters as well. But what can the app do that the website cannot? And why, when I use the app, am I redirected to the website if the app is the important platform that I need to download to my phone? Your promotion budget is not unlimited. We want people in our church taking next steps, getting involved. That's the point. That's why we discuss these things. Oh, church app, maybe yes or no. Fewer options equals more action. It's been proven time and time again. And it's easier for the staff. You might say, well, when we update our website, it also updates the app as well. Right, which gets to my point. What is the app doing that the website is not already? Now let's talk, though, about my bias. Surely there are some of you thinking, Brady, you're just saying this because you don't build church apps. You have an incentive because you build church websites with Nucleus. And that's a fair criticism. So what I'll say first is, do you think we couldn't build a church app platform? We choose not to because it doesn't align with our principles and values and beliefs about digital media. Go back to 2016. Watch that first video I made about apps. That predates any software I ever sold. That's just me and my experience with churches and digital not being convinced that apps made sense for most of us. Could my position ever change? Anything could change in the world of digital, which is why we evaluate every so often. But here we are. It's 2023, and my thesis is the same now as it was back then. For 99% of churches, an app will be a net negative. Invest in your website instead. Now, certainly some of you will have feedback. I'm glad to discuss with you in the comments. And thanks as always for your time, attention, and trust. We'll talk soon.